All right. First, I'd like to start by thanking the elders for this opportunity to come and teach this morning and continue my growth as a teacher. I'm also very thankful for this church family who is always encouraging here at Bremen. As I stated last year, this is definitely not my comfort zone, standing here before you this morning. Ironically, today's lesson, we will study Paul in a place where most of us would also not consider a comfort zone or a comfortable place to be. And Paul handled that, being in that unique position. So first of all, I'd like to start off with sort of how did we get here? And we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on with Paul before he related his conversion to the mob in Jerusalem. We're going to quickly look at where he was in his travels. We'll start with turning to Acts chapter 21 and about verse 8. This is around AD 57. He came to Caesarea and the house of Philip in verse 8. And after some time, the prophet Agabus came and warned Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. In verse 12, Paul was not persuaded, and we're going to start reading there. Then Paul answered, "What do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die at Jerusalem, for the name of the Lord Jesus." So when he would not be persuaded, we ceased saying, "The will of the Lord be done." So as I was preparing for this morning's lesson, I was looking at a lot of commentary, a lot of references, and I was really wondering, why did Paul insist on going to Jerusalem? It sounded like Agabus was giving him good counsel, saying, hey, you really don't want to go there. They want you. They want to get at you. And I found this in Johnson's notes on the New Testament, and I thought it was very well versed. So I wanted to read it to you this morning. Why should the apostle, with these certain dangers revealed to him, press on right into the stronghold of enemies, thirsting for his blood, infuriated by the accounts that came up from Asia and Europe of his success in converting Jews to Christ? Had not a deep sense of duty impelled him, we may be certain that he would not have done this. There could be no doubt that he braved the danger in order to prevent a schism that threatened the church. You see, false reports were circulated at Jerusalem concerning his teaching to Jewish Christians. The church there was filled with prejudice against him. From thence, Judaizing teachers went forth to interfere with his work. Hence, in a loving spirit, filled with that charity that suffers all things, and carrying large offerings gathered in the Gentile churches for the poor at Jerusalem, he came up to disarm that prejudice and show the falsehood of the stories alleged about his teachings. There are times when duty calls the man of God to face the danger. So when the Lord went to Jerusalem in spite of protest of his disciples, so went Luther to the Worms, though warned of his danger, and so went Paul to Jerusalem. So we see, even though that Paul was going to face great peril, he felt it was his duty, and he was brave to go. This was going to be his fifth time returning to Jerusalem since his memorable journey to Damascus, which was 22 years earlier. The brethren received him gladly. If we look further in verse 17, the brethren received him gladly, and he shared his report with the elders of the success of spreading the gospel with the Gentiles, verse 19. But then in verses 20 and 21, we see the root of the problem Paul is going to face in Jerusalem. He's going to face the zealous Jews. Many believed in Christ the Messiah, but considered and continued to struggle with the understanding that the old covenant had passed away. Paul had been teaching to the Gentiles especially and specifically that rites and rules of Judaism were no longer required. Paul, having been raised a Jew, honored the old law, but knew it was no longer required. So fast forward to verse 26. The next day, Paul returns to the temple, and that's where things start to go haywire. Let's read starting in verse 27. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Interesting reaction, right? Get him out. In their eyes, Paul was defying their holy place. With his known Gentile associates, he was polluting their temple. And the punishment for non-Jews' entrance into the temple was death. They wanted to kill him, but they knew they couldn't do that in the temple. So that would be profane if they had killed him in the temple. So they had to get him out so they could kill him. The chaos below was so noticeable to those that were posted in the garrison above the temple grounds, which is referred to as the Tower of Antonia. They descended the stairs to the crowd and quickly bound Paul, because surely this man at the heart of the swarm was a great criminal and deserved that level of wrath. So the guards are seeing Paul there, and they see the swarm around him, and it's noticeable that, hey, this guy's got to be a bad guy. It's like if you go somewhere and you see someone running out and people chasing after him, you're going to assume that that person being chased is done something wrong to deserve such a chaotic scene. So let's continue reading in verse 34. And some among the multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded them to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him!" Addressing the Jerusalem mob. Then, as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" And he replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And then there was a great silence. He spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying. So this sort of brings us to our focus for today's lesson. Paul is there. He's been led from the temple grounds up to the stairs leading to the Tower of Antonia, where the garrison was posted. I've got a picture here, actually, and you can't see it, but in the top right corner is the temple, and just at the very front corner, there's actually a raised tower, and that's Antonia's fortress castle, and that's where the garrison was posted. And they're looking down on the temple grounds so they could see the chaos. They could see the swarm of people coming after Paul. So they've climbed these stairs heading towards the tower. Paul's standing there. He spoke Greek to the chief captain, which was sort of interesting. It caught the chief captain sort of off guard, and that was because they were expecting him to be this Egyptian rebel that had been stirring commotion earlier, and so they were like, "Hey, you're not Egyptian. you're speaking Greek. And that's when Paul said, I'm from Tarsus. They I think that gave them then he says, hey, can I have a moment to speak? So it was enough to say, hey, I guess we'll give you this opportunity then. And gave Paul a very, like I said earlier, a unique opportunity to address those who were coming after him to kill him. So it's a very unique situation. Paul's being led away, being saved by Romans from the Jews, and here he is about to address the mob. In Acts 22, before we go further, I do want to point out some things that happen in verse 1 and 2 that are key to today's lesson. Paul then switches from talking Greek to the garrison and the chief captain to Hebrew to address the people in the mob. And when he began to address them, he didn't just say, quit trying to kill me. He said, greeted them like he was having a friendly conversation in Hebrew, and started very eloquently and very courteously to a crowd that was coming after him. And by using Hebrew and switching to Hebrew with them, they got quieter even further. And it calls that out in verse 2, that it was like, whoa, that's respectful, and I need to give this. They stopped their fervor and sort of gave him the audience for what he's going to then talk to them about. Let's start back in our text, at Acts 22, verse 3. I'm indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bare me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains, even those who were to Jerusalem to be punished. So Paul's going to start his defense here in these verses. He starts with three things, and I sort of want to point those out right now before we go into his actual account of his conversion. The intent of this information was to show his fellow Jews that he was born a Jew, reared as a Jew, and educated as a Jew. Though Paul was born in a Grecian city, Tarsus, he had been reared and educated in Jerusalem at the feet of the Honorable Gamaliel. And it was in keeping with Jewish custom. Paul probably had entered the Hillel school of religion at about the age of 15. The course of study at that school was the Old Testament in its entirety. And the Jews charged that he was teaching against Moses' law, and it was important for Paul to point out that, hey, was by culture a Greek, citizenship a freeborn Roman, but from a religious perspective, he was a Jew, a Hebrew of Hebrews. So that point one is, I'm indeed a Jew. His second point was he was zealous towards God. His zeal for God was honest and ardent. Even when he was persecuting, he thought he was God's sword, and he thought he was doing it on behalf of God. He was associating himself again with this crowd, relating to them so they could further see that they had things in common, also that to sort of show that he knew where they were. And then third, he said, I persecute this way to the death. This was probably the unsettling part of his defense to the Jews. When he declared that his persecution that came out of his zeal, where he thought he was serving God, led to the death of Christians. His persecution unto death was not confined to Stephen, and a lot of us are familiar with the fact that he held the garments for those who stoned and killed Stephen. But even when Paul addressed King Agrippa, he said, I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this I also did in Jerusalem. And I shut up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priest. And when they were put to death, I gave my vote against them. That was found in Acts 26, verses 9 through 10. He was an accomplice to the death of many Christians. He basically had national authority signed by the high priest, and it was a matter of official record. So he was sort of calling that out to them, saying, look, maybe you personally don't know, but it's a matter of official record that I have been in this position of persecuting and killing Christians. He had been the Sanhedrin's inquisitor-in-chief, the head persecutor of Jews. So we know right now, here's Paul. He's at the top of the tower, or the top of the stairs, looking down on this crowd that had been chasing him. He started off in Hebrew eloquently, courteously, and they gave him respect and silence to listen to what he had to say. He's gone over why he relates to them at this point, why he's here, where his background was, how he got here, and what's brought him to this point. And now he's going to dive into his own conversion. And he's going to talk about relating his conversion to them. He's basically going to give his testimony of what's happened to him so they can understand more of what brought him to this point in his journey. Let's begin reading in Acts 22, verse 6. Now it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon. Suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me, and I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. Continuing in verse 10. So I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all the things which are appointed for you to do. And since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. And a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there. Verse 13. Came to me, and he stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at the same hour I looked up at him. Then he said, The God of our fathers has chosen for you, that you should know his will, and see the just one, and hear the voice of his mouth. For you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. And now, why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. So this is actually, if you look in the book of Acts, there's 3 accounts of Paul's conversion. This is the second of those 3 accounts, and they're all found in Acts, as I mentioned. Luke's initial detailed account is found in Acts 9, and then Paul relates his conversion once again later to King Agrippa in Acts 26. But in this account, Paul's intent was to explain how he once was the chief persecutor of Christians, as we have established, then became a Christian and an apostle, and then was divinely, as we'll see later, divinely appointed to the Gentiles for service. I'd like to, at this time, talk about 5 things that sort of highlight this section. In my study for this morning's lesson, I found many great points through his message to the Jews concerning his conversion. And I would like to just pause briefly and sort of address each one of these points, or highlights, if you will. So number 1, nigh unto Damascus about noon. So suddenly a great light shone from heaven, shone around me. Midday, the brightest part of the days. Imagine, so the sun's at its greatest, shining at the brightest yet light that was cast upon Paul was far greater in brilliance and intensity. So much that he was blinded and even brought to his knees. Paul was definitely in the presence of the Lord. Number 2, who art thou, Lord? Verse 8. By custom, Jews referred to their superiors as Lord out of respect. Paul recognized he was in the presence of a superior. And Jesus answered, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecuted. With this answer from Jesus, Paul was assured that this Jesus was not an impostor or fake, as he and many other zealous Jews had thought him to be. And that was one of the things that was going on as well, is a lot of them thought, well, he's a good guy, but he's not the Messiah. They had a whole different concept of what the Messiah, or who the Messiah would be, and what would take place. And he wasn't what they were expecting. Number 3, what shall I do? Verses 10 through 12. This part is also in Luke's earlier account of Paul's conversion and here before the mob. Think about it. If there was ever a time when Jesus could have told Paul exactly what he needed to do to be saved, or even further, just outright saved him in that moment, this would have been the opportune time. I think about it, there was definitely an opportunity that if Jesus wanted to, he could have said, this is what you need to do. He could have said, you're saved, and he would have been saved. But he didn't do either of those two things. At that point, instead, the Lord told him to go to Damascus, where it will be appointed unto you what you must do. In verse 12, we see a core principle involved, that the gospel has been committed to earthen vessels. In 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7, Paul writes about this treasure given to us to carry, share, and preach. The Lord left a mortal man to inform Paul what he must do to be saved. Much like we are charged with today to be earthen vessels, to take the good news to others, so was Ananias. He was a good man of report and devout. Ananias, being sent directly by the Lord, was able to restore Paul's sight at once and confirm this was not his doing. Ananias was doing this for God and for Jesus. Number 4, the God of our Father hath appointed thee. Verse 14. There were 3 important things in this one verse alone that stood out. Paul was to know God's will. He would know, understand, and later obey the gospel to be saved. 2, he was to see the just one. Without seeing the Lord, he could not have been an apostle. And 3, Paul was to hear a voice from the mouth of the righteous one and just. This was also necessary for him to be an apostle. Number 5, now why are you waiting? Thou shalt be his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. And now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Verses 15 and 16. Ananias was to the point. You have a calling. What are you waiting on, Paul? Let's go. Paul had seen and heard the Lord, but still was not saved. His sins were not forgiven. He still had to obey. Obeying the gospel call and being baptized for the remission of sins. He needed his sins washed away. Despite what others in the religious world may believe or teach, the Bible, God's inspired word, and even Paul's conversion example here reaffirms the need for baptism. If it wasn't optional for Paul, it can't be optional for us either. Baptism is where the sinner comes in contact with the cleansing power of the blood, Romans 6, 1 through 4. It is baptism that we have those sins washed away and forgiven, washed anew to walk a new life. And that is surely what Paul did. As I continued my study, I noticed 3 things that sort of stood out to me at this point, other than the 5 that I've already highlighted, that I was these are what I call Michael's takeaways. Probably things that I struggle with, maybe some of you as well, that I needed reminding of, and I from studying this, had come to these takeaways. So the first one is look for opportunities in tough times. To be a godly example to others is tough, but it's really tough and when times get hard. I think you see a lot of people, their characters measured in tough times. When things are going smooth, it's easy to walk the walk, but it's when the stuff is getting real crazy, like it was for Paul, is when our true character is shown. Paul kept his wits. We should keep our wits. And he used that opportunity to teach and reach out to others. Number two, in those opportunities, so the second thing that I sort of took away and wanted to make sure I reminded myself is in those moments to be calm, courteous, and respectful. It doesn't hurt to be smart. Paul was smart. To switch to Hebrew and to relate to them, it drew them in to hear what he had to say. In tough times, it's hard to do those things. It's hard to be calm. It's hard to be smart and use your, to be flexible. He knew his audience. When he was talking to the chief captain, he was using Greek. But then when he went to talk to the mob, he was using Hebrew. He knew that he needed to adjust how he was saying and what he was saying. Relate to your audience. Empathize. Know their needs. He knew what these people needed. He knew why they were mad at him. So he was trying to sort of say, I understand where you're coming from. Hear me out. There's a defense for this. This isn't, I'm not trying to, he wasn't throwing darts at him and why are you trying to kill me? That's not very nice. He was like, look, I was like you. And three, and this probably should have been number one, is no soul shall be cast aside. When I think about my life and I think about people that I come across in my daily walk, I think about over the years people that I've seen and I go, they're too far gone. They're bad people. I'll go over here with this crowd because this crowd's more welcoming and more receptive or nicer, or I don't have to do as much work over here. That didn't stop Paul. Paul didn't go, oh, this is the angry mob. They're gone. I'm not going to be able to reach them. He still had a love for their souls. He still wanted to plant the seed. If you think back, Saul was really thought he was on God's team as he was persecuting the Christians, yet God had greater plans for him. He was the chief inquisitor, but God had other plans. We should not overlook anyone. No one is not worthy of being taught and shared the gospel. We are charged with seed planting, and not just where we feel fit, but everywhere and every chance we get. So back to Paul as he's standing here on the stairs. He is related to the audience in Hebrew that he's a Jew. What's brought him to this point? He's given him this audience the example of his conversion and what happened to him. And to no doubt at this point the audience is very attentive. They're listening and hanging on every word. And then the tide starts to change when he starts talking about his Gentile calling in verses 17 through 21. So we're going to continue in chapter 22, starting with verse 17. Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance and saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me." So I said, "Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I was also standing by, consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. And he said to me, 'Depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles.'" At this point, in verse 17, it had been 3 years since his conversion. So as he's talking to this Jewish mob, he's sort of going through his life, right? He's talked about his early life, he's talked about his conversion, and now he's talking about a period of time 3 years after his conversion. And he's telling them about how he was showed that the direction that to go to the Gentiles had been divinely appointed unto him. This was what I call the match that was about to restart the fire. And sort of leads us to the next point. The verdict is in. So let's continue reading in verse 22. And they listened to him until this word, and then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live." Then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know why they shouted so against him. So after giving Paul the podium, attention, and time, the zealous mob had heard enough. The verdict was in. Their desire to kill him had returned, and chaos resumed. We have to remember the background of why the Jews thought of the Gentiles with such fervor. And I think that merits sort of understanding. At this point, you're like, wait a minute, they just gave them all that time and attention, and now they're just like all of a sudden instantly enraged. But there's a background there that you need to be aware of, and most of you probably are. So, but one of the things is the Jewish people had long suffered at the hands, off and on, from foreign oppressors, basically to the point that loving your neighbor to them meant loving your Jewish neighbor, and that if anyone wasn't a Jew and they were your neighbor, then you didn't like them, you hated them. They also believed that the Messiah would come and that the Jews would at last be raised up in this high place, and the Gentiles would be abased, and the Jews would put their feet on the Gentiles' necks. They thought, when we have this Messiah, will take us and put everybody else down and raise us up. And they had it all wrong. But that's what they had thought, and they had suffered so long and were waiting, and now this Messiah comes, and guess what? He's going to say, all right, you're all welcome, and I want all of you. And that wasn't what in their heads. That's not how they saw it playing out. But here, Paul tells them that God basically had him pass them over and go to the Gentiles. So that was almost like an additional slap in the face. He was saying, I started here, but God said your job's going to be elsewhere, and sent to the Gentiles. And they took that now we're even more upset at you, because you're saying you passed us over. We weren't good enough, so you went to the Gentiles because God told you to. Also notice in verse 24, the chief captain was still confused. And this part I just sort of caught me sort of off guard, but then I thought about it. Of course he was confused. Why was the chief captain confused? Because he'd been speaking in Hebrew to the mob, but then they had been so quiet, and then all of a sudden they're enraged, and the guy's like, wait a minute, what just happened? He's like, I wasn't paying attention. Can someone catch me up? What just took place here? And again, it's like he didn't understand what he had shared with them in Hebrew, but all he knew that it couldn't be good, and this was going to require further investigation, because these people still wanted this man killed. And so that sort of brings us to the third point, and we're going to start with verse 25. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "It is lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned." When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Then the commander came to him and said, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained the citizenship." And Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman. And because he had bound him, the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priest and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So you sort of see why I called this section "Not My Jurisdiction." Paul was smart. First of all, he took a page out of Jesus' playbook, and I want to point that out. In verse 25, he did what? He used a question. is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and not condemned? And wait a minute, what did he say? He asked a question and he said one key word, Roman. And that was the escape word apparently. And Paul this wasn't his first rodeo. He had used the magic escape word Roman once before. If any of you remember back in Acts 16:37, he also used that in Philippi to escape with the officers and the magistrate. Basically his get out of free jail card. Here the centurion, as soon as he heard it, and he heard the word Roman, he knew to further torture or punish a Roman citizen without trial was wrong and must not go any further. Also, interestingly, in studying this, the chief captain called out that he had paid a great price for his Roman citizenship. And so what was going on in Rome at that time was Rome was corrupt, and if you had enough money and you weren't from Rome, you could pay for Roman citizenship. And so this chief captain called out, hey, I paid a great sum for my citizenship. And he's like, no, I got it legit. I was born as a Roman citizen and as a free Roman. And so it's very interesting that he points that out, that the chief captain sort of was part of that corruptness that was going on in Rome. So as the chapter wraps up, the chief captain is afraid and not wanting trouble for bounding Paul unjustly, and then decided to turn this matter over to the chief priest and all their council. Paul is going to have to give his defense before the Sanhedrin in chapter 23. Basically, he's moving from this jurisdiction of the chief captain now to he's going to go he's like, look, this isn't our problem. Someone else is going to have to address this, and it's out of our hands. So chapter 23 is going to be where they go and start, he meets with the Sanhedrin to Paul give his defense. But that's definitely a study for another time. So I want you to sort of, as I conclude today, to think about all that had happened in Paul's past, the negative memories, the things that haunted him as being the chief persecutor of Christians. He had to take all that off and cast it and take this new life of teaching, traveling, and mentoring in God's name, to where Paul went from chief persecutor of Christians to being one of the most wanted Christians, even to death. If Paul could overcome that, not one of our past should keep us from being God's earthen vessels and carrying his treasure to others. I think I know I went really quick through the lesson, but I think we see a great example here of not only of Paul relating his conversion, and I'll admit, as I started this study, I was like, well, I can't wait to hear how the people responded. And I was thoroughly, and I've read this many a times, I thoroughly didn't realize that this was just sort of like a pause button in the anger of the Jews. It wasn't really a success story where you come out at the end and you hear about all these people responded and changed their minds. And no, this was one of these where it was just a pain and a bump in the road. But it was a great learning opportunity for me, and hopefully for you guys as well, that Paul, in the moment of trial and furor, I guess is probably the best word to use for it, took an opportunity to teach and plant the seed and remind these people that he wasn't here of his own doing, that there was a greater purpose, and that greater purpose was God's. I thank you for your attention this morning. I hope that our study has been helpful for you, and that you've found some things that also that you could learn, maybe something new, and help you as you continue to grow as Christians. Thank you, guys.